Most people laugh at Bigfoot stories. Have you ever heard of a man who helped a Bigfoot give birth during a snowstorm, then risked everything to guide her entire family through deadly mountains just to keep them safe? This isn't folklore. It happened. Colorado. Winter of 1991. The man was Calder Boone, a former Navy officer who vanished into the wilderness after losing his wife and child in a tragic mountain crash. One morning, he found a weakened female Bigfoot lying in the snow, eyes not wild, but pleading. That moment began an unspoken bond that would change both their lives. This story comes from Redcloud Preservation files, first-hand reports from Ranger Roy McKinnon, and Calder's own handwritten journals. It's not myth, it's testimony. Watch till the end, and you'll learn. Why a broken man chose to protect something the world wants to hunt. What made a veteran ranger betray protocol for the first time in his life, and what a wild creature taught us about love, loss, and letting go. Wisp, the smallest of the Bigfoot children, nearly drowned in a flash flood. Calder saved her. Years later, it was a Bigfoot that saved him from falling to his death. No words, no promises, just action and trust. If you believe in quiet miracles, in the kind of truth that hides between the trees, don't skip this story, because for the first time, it's being told before it disappears back into the wild. The wind had a weight to it that morning, thick with the silence only a January forest could hold. Snow sat heavy on every branch like time itself had frozen mid-sentence. The world felt muted, tucked beneath layers of cold and memory. Calder Boone moved through it as if he were part of the land, his boots pressing deep into the crusted snow, leaving behind impressions that vanished almost as soon as he made them. Each step made a soft, dragging crunch that rose into the stillness like an echo of something older than language. He held the rifle loosely, not with urgency. This wasn't a hunt born of hunger or sport. It was ritual now. Habit. He moved through the woods not to conquer it, but to be reminded he still existed inside it. The rifle was as much a crutch for his memories as it was for meat. Venison jerky, dried cuts stacked in wax paper. He'd already gathered enough to last the month, but the quiet pulled him out again like it always did. Branches creaked overhead under the weight of snow, groaning like old men in their sleep. The scent of pine and frozen bark filled his lungs. Somewhere far off, a crow barked once and stopped. Calder's breath curled from his beard like smoke, slow and deliberate, the way he'd learned to breathe in the Navy during long watches on the deck. Steady, even when the world tilted. It was near the clearing past the creek bed that he first noticed something was off. The air shifted, not in temperature but in presence. There was a pause in the rhythm of the woods, like a held breath that wouldn't exhale. He paused behind a wide fir trunk, heart ticking a little louder. No movement, no sound. Just that quiet wait again, the kind that makes you second guess if something's watching. He moved slowly, rifle angled downward, not out of fear, but out of respect. Calder didn't take shots unless he had to. He stepped past a low shrub, boots sinking deep in the drift. And there it was. At the far edge of the clearing, partially buried in snow and shadow, lay a shape too large to be elk. It didn't belong, yet it didn't startle him. Not right away. The first thought wasn't fear. It was curiosity. The second was disbelief. The third stopped his breath entirely. Lying against a wind-bent pine was a figure draped in matted, blood-dark fur. Massive, slumped. A shape the world had told him wasn't supposed to exist. Not outside of stories. Not beyond whispered bar-side tales and blurry trail cams. But there she was. A mother. Dying, maybe. Breathing barely. Blood clung to the fur around her ribs like rust. Her arms were too long for any bear. The face wasn't a snout. It was closer to human than any animal had a right to be. The eyes were half-lidded, fogged, yet unmistakably aware. She looked up, and she did not snarl. Calder didn't move. His hands didn't raise the rifle. Instincts clashed in his body like cold and fire, but one memory overruled them all. The mountain road, the snow, his wife's last breath beneath a crumpled dashboard, the sound of his son's seatbelt snapping just before the world turned upside down. A crash, metal against rock, the silence afterward. He saw her eyes. This creature, the weight in them. It mirrored something he knew too well. Not beast, not monster, just something hurt. And maybe, God help him, something afraid. He swallowed hard. Time resumed. Carefully, without speaking, he pulled the strap of his bag over one shoulder and knelt. The ground bit through his jeans. He pulled out a strip of jerky and laid it gently on the snow, just inside the edge of her reach. The gesture felt ancient, like a contract written in breath and blood. Then, slowly, he stepped back. 5 paces. 10. His boots crunched louder now. The wind picked up again, stirring snow into little whirlwinds. She didn't move to grab the meat. Not yet. But her eyes tracked him. Not as prey. Not with malice. Just as something that wasn't quite ready to die yet. He watched her watching him. The snow falling soft between them. For one strange, impossible moment, the space between man and myth dissolved. That night Calder didn't light the stove. He sat near the fireplace, wrapped in his old navy blanket, watching the coals from the morning still pulsing faint red like the last embers of a dying star. The cabin groaned in the cold, wood contracting, reminding him it was older than even his time here. A shelf above the fire held a tin of tea he never drank, a photo of a woman holding a toddler in a white knit hat, and a pine cone covered in gold glitter. Something his son had made in first grade, the year before the accident. The dust had settled thick on them, but he never wiped it clean. He didn't sleep much. The memory of her face, the Bigfoot, not his wife, lingered behind his eyes. The way she didn't flinch. The way her eyes almost seemed to plead, not for help, not even for mercy, just to be seen. By morning the clouds had cleared. Blue sky cracked above the trees like a promise he didn't quite believe in. Calder moved slower that day. He didn't bring the rifle, just the bag, just another piece of jerky, a strip of old blanket, a canteen of melted snow water. He didn't know what she needed. Maybe nothing, maybe just time. But he walked anyway. Back to the clearing. She was still there, moved slightly, propped against the pine differently now. The snow beneath her was stained whiter. She was alive, but not strong. Not yet. Her belly looked rounder today, full, tense, not just wounded, pregnant. His breath caught. He placed the jerky on a flat stone. He poured the water into a carved hollow in the snow. He tucked the blanket over a rock nearby. Not on her, not close enough to offend, but near enough that if she reached, she could take it. Then he sat. Not close, a few yards away, on a stump barely free of snow. He didn't talk to her. He talked to the air. He told it about the Navy, about the Pacific, the calm before typhoons, about how salt crusts into your skin after weeks at sea. He told it about the crash, about what the EMT said, about how sometimes you survive in body but not in soul. He didn't cry, not because he couldn't, but because the air didn't ask him to. The Bigfoot didn't make a sound. She didn't move, but her eyes never closed. He left again before dark. On the ridge above the clearing, something stirred. A shape moved between the trees with a quiet too perfect to be coincidence. Calder paused before climbing back down. He knew that walk, that heavy, deliberate pace. It wasn't a predator. It was a sentinel. He saw it just briefly. Massive, upright, dark against the pale snow. A male, maybe. Watching, not charging, not hiding, just being. A shadow that knew exactly where it was supposed to be. He didn't wave, didn't speak. just nodded once, like the way two old men might at the end of a funeral. Back at the cabin, he stared out the frosted window, hand on the sill. The forest wasn't empty anymore. Maybe it never had been. Maybe the silence he'd wrapped himself in for years had only ever been waiting to be broken. He couldn't say what had changed in him that day. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But that night, he lit the stove, and for the first time in months, he let the tea steep. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, no longer just cold, but carrying something else, something ancient, something breathing. And from far away, down in the dark between the trees, the snow shifted beneath a weight not made by boots. Something real, not a story, not a ghost, a presence made of bone and breath and eyes that remembered. Calder didn't sleep. He didn't need to. Not anymore. The fire kept him company. So did the memory of a look that didn't ask for anything. Just to be known, just to be left alone, just to survive, and maybe, if the world allowed it, to be loved in silence. The forest didn't speak. It didn't need to, because what had begun in the clearing wasn't done yet. Something ancient had stirred, and winter, though quiet, wasn't through with them. Not yet. By late February, the snow no longer came in sheets, but lingered in patches, loosening its grip on the forest like a hand finally letting go. The earth below began to show signs of breath again. Damp soil along the roots, the slow trickle of meltwater threading through pine needles. The sky stayed pale and bone-colored, as if winter still hovered behind it, reluctant to leave completely. But something in the air had shifted. Calder Boone felt it the moment he stepped past the cedar line and back into the clearing. She was still there, nestled beneath a low-bending pine that sagged under its own weight. The creature hadn't vanished like some waking dream. She had moved, though, not far. Just enough that the surrounding snow showed signs of rearrangement, of dragging limbs and shifted posture. Calder stood still, his boots sinking just slightly into the slush. The hush of the woods held its breath around him, like it remembered what he'd done last time and was waiting to see if he'd do it again. The first thing he noticed was her belly, fuller than it had been weeks before. Not just thick with fur or swollen from injury, but rounded in a way he recognized. Expectant, carrying, life inside something already too rare to believe. She didn't look at him right away. Her head was bowed, heavy, but she was awake, breathing. Snow clung to the strands of her fur like lint on the wool. The blood from January had dried, flaked off, healed into dark patches. She was stronger, maybe, but not safe. Not yet. He hadn't come empty-handed. From his pack, Calder pulled out a folded square of torn tarp and a coil of rope. He'd brought a length of pine poles, too, cut and carved smooth at the ends. No hammer, no nails, nothing artificial. Just what could be found and used without a trace. He moved slowly, deliberately. Not toward her, but to the open space a few yards away. She watched now. He could feel it. Her eyes, dark and low beneath her brow, followed every motion. He didn't speak. Not to her. Not yet. It took the better part of an hour to raise the makeshift shelter. He didn't want walls, only cover. A sloped roof angled toward the wind, lashed between two trees. The poles held, creaking faintly as he tightened the ropes. It wouldn't last a storm, but it would last a night. Maybe more. He draped the tarp over it, weighted the corners with stones, stepped back, and exhaled. The thing looked like something from a survival guide scrawled in a war journal. Crude, but functional. Still not a word. He sat near the tree line again, on a wide stump hollowed in the center, and pulled his jacket tighter around his chest. The cold didn't bother him much anymore. Not since he'd gotten used to the kind that comes from inside, the kind you carry in your gut. He looked out over the snow field that once held nothing but silence and death and saw something different now. It looked like a decision, one neither of them had spoken aloud, but both had made. The fire was small, barely a flicker. He used the same method as always. Steel and flint, dry tinder, a little sawdust he'd saved from cutting wood for the stove. It caught like memory doze, slow and then sudden. The light danced against the tarp, casting long shadows behind it like ghosts creeping out of their hiding places. He still didn't face her. He talked to the flame. He told it about Da Nang, about the boat that caught fire in '74, how the engine didn't stop grinding even after the smoke had swallowed the decks, about the men he pulled from the sea, how the water looked black under napalm sky. He spoke of silence, too, the silence after his wife stopped breathing, and how the hospital tile felt warm under his knees, only because he'd been kneeling too long. He didn't cry. That had dried up somewhere back in the '80s. But his voice cracked once, just once, and the fire sputtered like it heard him. Behind him, there was stillness, but not absence. She didn't move closer, not yet. But her breathing had changed, slower, less guarded. Calder didn't need her to understand English. He just needed her to stay. That night, back at the cabin, the radio crackled with more than static. He didn't keep it on often. The CB unit sat on a shelf above the woodpile, mostly untouched unless a storm was coming in, or Roy McKinnon was supposed to check in. But tonight, the voice caught his ear. Copy that. East of Lake City, about 5 miles past Copper Creek. Large prints confirmed, bigger than bear, plaster mold already poured. Calder stood still, half-unbuttoned coat in his hands. Another voice answered through the fog of static. Younger, cockier. Prints damn near the size of a dinner plate. Looked fresh, too. You think it's that thing from the rumors? Laughter, faint. Hell, I don't know, but the paper's gonna eat it up. He switched it off. The air inside the cabin thickened. Not with heat, but with worry. Calder hadn't told anyone. Not Roy. Not the locals. Not even the pine trees, who'd been loyal in their silence all these years. But someone had found something. A footprint. Close enough to guess the truth. He didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, whittling at a scrap of wood with his old pocket knife, hands moving in rhythm with a mind that wouldn't quiet down. He carved a shape he didn't mean to. A curve, a ridge, the edge of an eye. Not human, but not animal either. He pressed his thumb into the wood grain. The face stared back. The next morning, he returned to the clearing early. Frost still rimmed the edges of the tarp, and steam curled off the snow where her breath had warmed the ground beneath. She had pulled herself part way under the shelter in the night. Not fully, but just enough to show him something had shifted. A choice, maybe. Or just exhaustion. Either way, she hadn't fled. He sat again, this time closer. Only a few feet between them now. The space where breath becomes shared air. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But in that stillness, the woods leaned in. The pines creaked like old bones. A raven passed overhead, silent. Calder watched her shift slightly, one hand curled protectively over her stomach. The roundness was undeniable now. Time was moving. Whether they were ready or not, the news hadn't reached the town yet. But it would. Lake City was a quiet place, but not immune to noise. And the wrong kind of curiosity could kill faster than any rifle. He knew what men did when they wanted proof. He'd seen it in war, in deer blinds, in the cold glint of trophy cameras. He leaned forward, his voice low, as if speaking to the pine needles themselves. "We don't have long," he whispered. She blinked once, slow, heavy. He didn't know if she understood him, but her eyes held something that made him think she might. And somewhere, miles away, another radio crackled to life. Another plaster mold dried on a cabin table. And in the taverns around Lake City, men passed around photographs of a footprint big enough to fit a boot inside. The danger wasn't the forest. It never had been. The danger was the need to be right. The hunger to prove, to name, to claim. And as Calder sat watching her breath rise and fall, he knew the days of silence were numbered. But for now, for this moment, the clearing still belonged to the snow. to the fire, to two survivors sharing a space that no one else could understand. And even as the world began to close in, even as rumors spread faster than rivers in thaw, he stayed seated, quiet, not moving. Because sometimes the loudest act of love is to simply stay, even when the world outside forgets how to listen. And somewhere behind the trees, the wind carried a scent not of pine or ash, but of soil just beginning to wake up again. Not quite spring, but no longer winter. Not yet. The storm came without warning, slipping in under cover of night like a breath held too long. Snow began to fall sideways, carried by a wind that scraped the treetops raw and howled across the mountains like something ancient had stirred and found its voice. Calder Boone stood beneath the tarp, arms raised, gripping the rope lashes with frozen fingers as the makeshift shelter groaned and buckled against the wind. His breath came hard through his teeth, misting in gusts that vanished the moment they left his mouth. The pine poles creaked, one of them giving a dry pop like a warning knuckle against the air. He dug his boots deeper into the slush-packed earth and leaned his weight into the gust, shoulders straining beneath the bulk of his coat. Snow whipped around him in sheets, flattening the world into a single blur of white and shadow. The forest beyond the clearing had vanished, erased by storm and wind. Only the shelter remained. Only the firelight flickering low from a pit of damp logs barely catching flame. Only the shape of her body, hunched and silent, tucked low behind the windbreak, fur slick with snowmelt and heaving in time with a breath that was growing tighter by the hour. Her eyes flashed once in the glow, tired, sharp, aware. But not of him, of pain. She was close. He didn't speak. There was no point. She wouldn't understand his words, and besides, she wasn't listening to anything beyond her own body now. Calder knew that look. He'd seen it before. In horses during foal, in women too, back in his days working medical aid during flood evacuations downstate. It was a look beyond language. Raw, focused, already halfway inside another world. And then the sound came, a low groan, not quite human, not quite animal, long and low, vibrating through the snow like thunder trapped beneath the earth. Calder stepped back instinctively, but not from fear. He lowered himself to the ground, knees stiff in the cold, and lit another fire. Smaller this time, just enough to keep the cold from freezing the breath right out of the air. She shifted. Her hands, long, wide-palmed, heavy with muscle, clawed into the snow. Her body arched forward, and in the faint firelight Calder saw the tremble in her back, the way her fur bristled along her spine like grass before a lightning strike. Then a sound broke from her chest, sharp and brief, and her mouth opened in silence. It was time. The storm raged. Snow pushed against the tarp in gusts. The fire guttered, nearly dying. But Calder reached out and shielded it with his back, pulling a pouch from his belt. He sprinkled the fine sawdust he'd brought, dry, cedar-rich, hoarded from his wood shop like memory itself, and the flame caught again. Warm light bled across the snow, dancing against her fur, throwing long shadows that wavered like spirits on the edge of vision. The first cry didn't come from her. It came from something smaller. He couldn't see it at first. Her body was hunched low, arms curled around her knees. The blood had come, thick and dark, steaming against the snow. But so had movement. Calder leaned forward, eyes narrowed against the wind, and caught it. A shape, tiny in comparison, coated in dark fur, slick with birth, crawling weakly along the snow like something that wasn't quite sure what air was yet. The mother's hand reached back, trembling, and pulled the infant in close, held it to her chest, rocked forward, shuddered again. Another cry, a second shape. This one lighter in fur, a streak of brightness down the middle of its chest that glinted in the firelight like a faint reflection of the moon. It squirmed, strong, faster than the first. Its arms reached instinctively, pulling itself toward the warmth of her body without needing direction. And then the third, smallest, barely the size of a duffel bag. It didn't cry. It shivered. Calder's breath caught. He inched forward, just slightly, just enough to see. The tiny thing lay curled near her foot, unmoving. Snow began to gather on its back. She hadn't noticed it yet. Her eyes were shut tight, her body curled around the other two, instinct carrying her through the moment like a tide. Calder's hand moved without thinking. He took a dry cloth from his pack, balled it in his palm, and with the slowest steps he'd ever taken, moved toward the third one. The wind screamed around him. The tarp flapped wildly overhead, but he heard nothing but the sound of that little body breathing, just barely. Each breath a flicker of frost against the air. He knelt. The snow pressed wet into his jeans. He reached out, the cloth hovering just above the creature's side. It twitched, alive. He placed the cloth gently over its back and stepped away. No touch, no theft, just warmth. The mother stirred, her head raised, her eyes locked on his. She saw what he'd done. There was no sound, no movement, just the breath between them. Just the weight of the storm pressing down on everything that didn't matter. Then, slowly, her hand reached toward the third child, pulled it in, tucked it beneath her arm with the others. The fire popped. Calder exhaled. He sat again, this time without watching. He let the wind whip at his shoulders, let the cold bite through the layers, let the moment be what it was. Behind him, the forest groaned. The boughs swayed and cracked beneath the snow's weight, and from somewhere far beyond the clearing, just beyond the reach of the storm, something moved. Not a bear, not an elk, something upright. It didn't come forward. It didn't make a sound. But Calder felt it. The eyes, the presence, the silent acknowledgement. He wasn't alone here, not really, not anymore. And the newborns, 3 of them now, curled into their mother's warmth as if the world hadn't just been rewritten. Stone, the strongest. Dark fur, wide shoulders, already stretching with muscle. Glint, quick-eyed, restless, that silver patch on the chest like a beacon. And Wisp, smallest, quietest, but still there, still breathing. The storm didn't let up until morning. The trees were covered in layers so thick they looked sculpted. The fire had died sometime in the night, leaving only ash and the faintest smell of cedar. Calder hadn't slept. He didn't try. He sat by the tarp, wrapped in his coat, watching the sky brighten through the storm's unraveling edge. Pale blue, then peach, then gold, breaking through the trees like forgiveness. He turned toward them. They were asleep now, all 4. The mother curled around her young like stone around fire, their breaths rising together, steam rising off their bodies, warmth in a world that had none to give. He didn't speak, just watched. And for the first time in decades, something in him shifted. Something unlatched. Not loudly, not suddenly, but like ice cracking beneath sunlight. Quiet, relentless. He didn't go back to the cabin right away. He stayed long enough to be sure they were safe, that the snow wouldn't bury them, that no prints had followed him in. Then he walked, back into the woods, back through the trees, boots sinking in fresh powder, the forest still humming in his ears. The air tasted different, like something had ended, or maybe just begun. And long after he disappeared behind the pines, the clearing stayed warm with breath. 3 lives born in stormlight, none of them human. And yet, somehow, everything human was now tied to them, whether the world was ready or not. And the wind, when it moved through the trees again, didn't sound quite as lonely anymore. By April, the forest began to loosen its shoulders, exhaling slowly after the long-held breath of winter. The ice along the stream had split open in jagged seams, water moving beneath like blood returning to stiff veins. Patches of earth showed through the snow now, wet, dark, full of worms. Above the ridgeline, sunlight fell in long strokes, not warm yet, but no longer cruel. It was the kind of thaw that didn't happen all at once. It crept, cautious, as if the forest wasn't sure it trusted the season yet. Calder Boone had started carving again. Each morning he'd sit on the porch of his cabin with a cup of black coffee, steam curling past his beard, and he'd take his knife to salvaged planks from the old shed he never bothered fixing. He didn't make furniture. He didn't craft signs or crosses or anything practical. He just carved. Shapes, lines, scratches that turned into symbols only he understood. Every time he returned from the clearing, he'd add a new mark. A little wider if stone had run farther than usual. A notch if Glint had tilted his head at something odd. A shallow groove if Wisp had simply made it through the day. The board was nearly half full now. The days were longer. The family was growing. He hadn't given them names out loud. Not really. But in his mind, the three little ones had begun to separate from one another in ways that felt more than physical. Stone moved like a stump ripped free. Solid, reckless, always toppling something. Glint couldn't stop staring. At branches, birds, his own reflection in a puddle, and Wisp. Wisp followed behind them like a leaf caught in wind. Quiet, slower, but stubborn. Calder watched him try to climb a stump for 15 straight minutes once, slipping every time, yet never walking away. They didn't come close. They didn't reach for him. But they didn't hide anymore. Their mother let them wander, just far enough for their silhouettes to stretch into the sun. When Calder stepped into view, she didn't growl or move to shield them. She just watched, always watched. Her body stayed low, her shoulders wide, a constant barrier if one was needed. But the need had faded, at least for now. That morning, Calder had brought a small pouch of dried cranberries and crushed walnuts. He didn't offer them directly, just scattered the contents on a moss-covered stone near the edge of the hollow. Glint was the first to sniff it. Didn't eat, just watched the birds dart in, take pieces, dart away. Stone stomped his foot once and the birds vanished, but the food remained. Wisp edged closer, nose twitching, then looked back at his mother. Her head didn't move. That was enough. He stepped forward and took a piece of walnut in his tiny hand. Calder didn't smile. He didn't need to. Back at the cabin, he found Roy McKinnon leaning against the porch rail like he'd been waiting for hours. The ranger looked tired. His uniform had more creases than usual. The patch on his shoulder was fraying. He held his hat in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other. "Thought you said you weren't feeding anything out there," Roy said. Calder didn't answer. Just set the pouch down on the porch table and eased himself onto the wooden bench, boots cracking the layer of dry pine needles beneath. Roy handed him the paper. This one made the Lake City Ledger, front page. Calder didn't need to open it. The headline said enough. Footprints found along creek bed. Feds may investigate. The photo was blurry. The plaster cast looked like something left by a man wearing oven mitts on his feet. But it was real. Too real. The article didn't mention exact coordinates, but the description was close enough. "I warned you," Roy said, voice softer now. "That hunter, McClure, the one who makes those damn TikToks for tourists, he brought the mold into town and showed it off outside Mackenzie's bar. Now every guy with a pickup and a GoPro thinks we've got ourselves a cryptid gold rush." Calder stared out past the porch, where the tree line began to thicken into the hills. He didn't blink much anymore. Roy rubbed the bridge of his nose. The Forest Service filed a request for aerial survey teams, federal wildlife biologists. Not the kind who care what's out there, just the kind who want to track it, tag it, label it. And they've got backing. They're saying it's about invasive species. Corridor mapping, whatever buzzword they can stick on it. But you know damn well what they're after. Calder finally looked at him. "They'll never understand what it is," Calder said. Roy let out a low breath. "No, but they don't need to. They just need to document it. Once, then it's over." He sat down beside Calder, the bench creaking under their combined weight. The silence between them felt old, like something passed down. Roy pulled a small envelope from his jacket. Inside was a map, hand-drawn. He unfolded it and pointed to a crescent-shaped cut through the Uncompahgre, just southeast of where the old mining trail ended. Redcloud Canyon, he said. You remember that ridge? Place we camped back in '89, 2 valleys over, no roads in. Closest thing to a trail is half erased under landslides. You'd have to take them over the Elk Pass line. But if you make it, there's caves, water, enough cover to vanish. Calder didn't speak, but he took the map. Roy stood up. They'll be here by June. The 2 men didn't shake hands. They never did. By that afternoon, Calder was gathering supplies, quietly. No engine noise, no trips into town. Just rope, cured leather, tools from the cabin. The essentials. He buried his extra food stores in a waterproof cache 3 miles north. Marked it with a broken antler. If he came back, he'd find it. If he didn't, no one else would. That night he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire carving again. But this time the marks were different. Not just tallies, not just symbols. He carved 3 shapes. Uneven, clumsy, but real. One broad, one slender, one small. Then, beneath them, a curve. Not a smile, not quite, but something like it. And all the while, the snow melt trickled through the pine roots like it was carrying the story forward. Unseen, but moving. Somewhere in the dark, a branch snapped. Not near, not close, but not random either. And Calder looked up. Just once, into the night beyond his windows, where the silhouette of the mountain met the stars and felt the weight of spring crawling forward. Not a season, a choice. And in the morning, he'd begin the path toward the pass. Not alone, but with every step carrying more than his own shadow. Because some promises didn't need to be spoken. They only needed to be walked. By June, the snow had all but vanished from the lower woods, leaving behind a landscape slick with mud and streaked with new growth. Grass climbed up through the thaw, soft and bright in the clearings where trees had opened their arms to sun. The rivers ran high with meltwater, fast and white, carving old paths into deeper ones. From his cabin window, Calder Boone watched the green return like an old friend you don't quite trust, but still open the door for. It was time to leave. He'd spent weeks studying the map Roy had drawn, memorizing every contour line, every bend of the ridges, every narrow gorge that could serve as cover or become a trap. Redcloud Canyon sat nestled like a closed hand at the edge of the Uncompahgre, hidden behind a fold of mountains most folks didn't bother with. No trails went there anymore. The old ones had collapsed decades ago under landslides and roots. If someone wasn't already looking for it, they'd never stumble onto it. But the way wasn't simple. Calder knew that. He packed slow, quiet, no checklist, just instinct. Thick rope, strong enough to hold weight, dried venison wrapped in cheesecloth, a tattered wool blanket, a rusted compass, a carved wooden charm he'd made without thinking, shaped like a small handprint with 3 notches along the side. It didn't mean anything, but he packed it anyway. The Bigfoot mother had begun to trust him in a way that wasn't about closeness. She never let him near the children, never reached out. But when he appeared, she no longer turned her back, no longer stiffened. He took that as permission. He began to mark the trail, not with ribbon or chalk, but in ways the wind couldn't erase. Stones piled in triangles, bark shaved smooth in thumb-sized circles. A path not for humans, but for someone who noticed changes in the trees. The 3 young ones had grown quickly. Stone towered over his siblings now, all chest and arms and unthinking momentum. Glint, lean and always looking. Wisp, still small but steady, with a walk that said more than any sound he made. Calder watched them from a distance, studying the way they moved through the world like it belonged to them, but always with one eye back toward their mother. And she, in turn, had begun to move slower. Her gait had changed since the storm. One leg stiff, maybe a tendon torn in the birth, maybe a wound never fully healed. He saw the way she'd leaned on her knuckles more, how she paused longer at rises. She would not make the journey fast. But he wasn't looking for fast. He was looking for hidden. They left before dawn. The sky was a dark slate, the stars faint as breath against glass. Calder stood at the edge of the clearing and waited. He didn't call, didn't gesture, just waited. One by one, they came out of the shadows. First the mother, then Stone lumbering behind her, Glint moving like a question mark. Wisp last. Always last. They didn't walk side by side. They followed his pace like deer follow wind. The first part was easy. Down through the dried stream bed, along the hollow where elk had once bedded. The ground there was soft, the brush low. But soon the terrain tilted. Boulders from old rock falls littered the slope, slick with moss and sharp where rain had split them. Calder took the lead. He didn't look back, but he could hear them. The mother's breath came heavy. The little ones kept close. Midway through the climb, they reached the first challenge. A sloping ridge of loose shale that crumbled underfoot with each step. Calder tested the rocks with his boot, then crouched and threw the rope across a low limb that arched like a bent spine above the trail. He didn't try to help them directly, just tied the rope and stepped aside. She looked at it for a long time. Then she grabbed it and pulled. They crossed without sound. It wasn't until the third day that the real danger came. A wide river, faster than it looked, wound through the pass like a snake with foam for scales. Calder had crossed it before, once, years ago, but the old log that served as a bridge then had rotted through. Only a narrow, splintering trunk remained, stretched over the water like a dare. He walked it first, hands out, breath shallow. Each step creaked, but he made it. He turned just in time to see Wisp step forward, curious, too fast. The mother hissed low, sharp and panicked. Wisp froze, then slipped. His feet went out from under him, arms flailing, body vanishing over the edge in a blur of fur and light. Calder didn't think. He grabbed the rope off his shoulder, tied the end to the broken stump behind him, and dove. The rope jerked tight around his waist like a punch to the ribs, but it held. His boots scraped bark. His fingers sliced open on wet wood. Below, the water churned. He saw Wisp, clinging to a jut of root just above the current, eyes wide and terrified. Calder dropped lower, the rope cutting into his back. He reached out, one hand open. Wisp didn't move, so Calder spoke, not loud, not with force, just one word. "Come!" The small hand reached. It shook, but it reached. Calder grabbed it and pulled. The current caught them both for a second, cold as knives, but the rope held. He scrambled up with Wisp pressed to his chest. The moment his boots hit soil again, the mother was there, arms wide, voice trembling, not angry, just full of something ancient and raw. She took Wisp and pressed him to her shoulder, eyes meeting Calder's only once. There was no question in them, just a kind of stunned gratitude. He sat down on the other side of the river, chest heaving, blood dripping from his palms. The rope had burned clean through the outer layer of his skin, but he was smiling. Not wide, not proud, just a tight, quiet smile that didn't need an audience. He looked at his hands, felt the sting, and remembered the wheel of the old station wagon twisting beneath his grip in '78. The cliff coming fast, the sound of glass exploding, the silence that followed. This time, he'd pulled someone back. They camped that night beneath a slanted overhang, the stone overhead scarred by centuries of wind and rain. The fire crackled low. No one slept much. In the dark, Calder heard movement. He didn't look, just whispered, "You're still here." There was no reply, only the soft crunch of a heavy step beyond the ring of light. He knew that sound. The male had followed, not close, not with them, but behind, watching. Not enemy, not kin, something else. The next morning they reached the ridgeline. Redcloud Canyon opened below like a secret. Green and wild, untouched, threaded with fog. A place not marked on any map, not claimed by any sign. Just trees and wind. and the sound of something moving that didn't belong to the world of names. Calder stood on the edge, the morning sun bleeding gold through the trees. He turned to them. They didn't speak, but they knew. And as they began the slow descent, his hands still stinging, his legs still aching, he felt the weight of the rope around his waist like a memory, not of pain, but of holding on, and this time, not letting go. By late August, the heat had thinned. Not gone, just quieter. The air still held the burn of dry pine needles and sun-baked rock, but the evenings came quicker, darker, sharper around the edges. The forest no longer felt lazy. It listened again. Everything alive moved with purpose now. There were fewer sounds during the day. Less bird song, less wind. Like the mountains were bracing for something. Calder Boone had learned to sleep light. Not because he feared anything nearby. What lived in Redcloud Canyon did not come to harm him. What troubled him came from beyond its edges, down the slopes, up the trails, with dogs and radios and boots that didn't belong. The family had settled into a quiet rhythm. The Bigfoot mother rarely left the shade now. Her limp had worsened. The young ones had grown stronger. Stone had become bold, charging uphill with the thunder of a yearling moose. Glint watched everything from a crouch, blinking slow, memorizing. Wisp still stuck close, always the last to eat, but never out of step. Calder kept his distance. He wasn't part of their world. He only kept them tethered to a future that might not crush them. He'd been listening to the air again, the way it carried things, and it brought something wrong. 3 nights ago, he'd seen it. From the rim above the canyon, a shimmer in the dark. Not firelight, not stars. It blinked low, artificial. Then came the sound, faint at first, then clearer. The high click of radio chatter, the sharp whistle of signal burst, the low rhythm of boots pacing stone, and the smell of tobacco smoke on synthetic wind. He moved fast. Back to the den where the mother lay. No need to explain. She watched him set up the hideout, shoved into a shallow bend of stone like an open mouth facing the slope. He covered it with old pine limbs, fresh dust, deer moss. Not a cave, but a hiding place. Not for days, just for one night. A night they couldn't be seen. They went silent when he brought them in. Even the little ones, as if the fear had passed through him into them by breath alone. He crouched low beside them, back pressed against the inner wall. Wisp huddled near his leg. Calder didn't move. He didn't dare. Then came the dogs. You could always tell them by breath first. Not bark, not growl. Just panting, steady, excited. Nose to earth, followed by boots and flashlights cutting stripes across the moss. Calder curled himself around Wisp. The light swept just above the rocks. A voice, close. Too close. Hold up, got something? No, just heat bounce, probably rabbit. Another voice, older, slower. Push west, we'll loop back toward the stream bed. Glint shivered once. The mother shifted, nearly blocking all 3 of her young with her body. Calder kept his hand flat on the dirt. Every sound outside felt louder inside. A crunch of boots on dry leaves, a click of metal, a cough, the static snap of walkie-talkie rubber. They didn't pass more than 15 feet from the hide. He heard them fade, one at a time. The slope dulled their steps, then silence again, but it didn't last. Someone else had stayed behind. He heard the breath first, not close, not pacing. Still, watching? Then a twig snapped, not 3 yards above the hide. A signal. And Calder knew who it was. He waited. Then the softest movement. The scrape of graphite on bark. When the sun came up and the dogs were gone, Calder crawled out first. The air smelled like sweat and chemical plastic. He checked the ridge. There, on the side of an old spruce, was the mark. A small arrowhead, blackened charcoal, pointing south. Roy had been here, and he hadn't said a word. Calder covered the path behind him with rock dust. Erased tracks, rubbed moss over the packed trail. Then he circled back. The mother and the little ones were safe, but they were tired. Their eyes looked different that morning. Not from fear, from knowing. Later that evening, he crept back to the ridge. They were camped in the lower basin now, 5 of them, dressed in matching gray shirts, utility belts. One man carrying a clipboard strapped to his chest like it meant something. They had maps, radios, tags. One woman sat by a folding table, flipping through pictures that made Calder's stomach twist. They'd printed the footprint, magnified it, called it Specimen B. The dogs had been tied back to trees. 4 lean hounds, shaved close, ears notched, eager and still. And then Calder saw Roy, not leading, just nearby, arms crossed, eyes down, but there. He didn't speak to the woman, didn't speak to anyone, just turned slowly, stepped behind a tree, and vanished out of sight. The search had begun. That night, Calder slept with a knife under his shirt, not because he thought he'd use it, but because the feeling had returned. That helplessness, the one that came just before you lose something you're not strong enough to keep. In the middle of the night, Wisp sat beside him. No noise, just presence. Looking out the cave mouth into the darkness like he could see what Calder couldn't. The next morning Roy came again. He didn't speak. Just left a bundle at the base of a tree where Calder would find it. Inside, dried apples, a water pouch, and a single page torn from a government report. Survey team split into sectors. Grid H focused on canyon mouth. No UAVs authorized, no IR scans. Search limited to foot patrols, no photographic evidence permitted without direct approval. It was protection in its own broken way. Roy was risking everything to slow them down, and Calder knew there wasn't time. The family couldn't run far. Not with her leg. Not with stone breaking branches with every step. Not with the heat returning and the trail drying out. He had to do something else. He waited until the stars came out, then packed the flare. One flare, the red one. The one Roy had given him 5 years ago after the winter blackout. Told him to use only if the snowmobiles ever broke down again. He packed it into his vest, watched the fire die, and whispered to the darkness, "If I don't come back, you keep going." He walked through the night like a ghost, feet never too heavy, breath tight in his chest. At the edge of the slope above the basin, he saw them. The team. Asleep. Only one sentry walking slow circles near the hounds. He stepped wide, circled far, and laid the trail. A false one, old blood on a rag. Bits of hide from a deer kill. Mud pressed with the outline of fingers made to mimic toes. Then he lit it. The flare hissed to life like a scream. Red light bled across the sky. It didn't rise, just burned in his hand. Calder stood tall on the ridge. One man, exposed. And the forest answered. Dogs barked. Men shouted. The red spilled over the tree line like a wound opening. He ran, fast. No more silence, no more hiding. He gave them something to chase. He led them away from the canyon mouth, toward the rockslide basin, toward dead ends and blind turns. And when he ducked behind a stone and the voices passed him and the radio static faded again into trees, he laughed once, short and breathless. Because the silence behind him remained untouched, because no one had screamed, because the family was still hidden. But far behind him, out past the clearing where the false trail began, a shape had moved. It stood still, massive, watching, not from fear, not from loyalty, but because this wasn't over. And as the red light faded into smoke, and the woods swallowed his scent again, Calder felt the burn on his palms from the rope all those days ago. Still healing, still open. And he knew, just like then, he had to hold on a little longer. The storm built slowly, not in the sky, but in the earth, in the way animals moved, in the silence between pine needles. The kind of storm you don't hear first. You feel it. September in the high country always carried a sharpened edge, but this time, the edge had teeth. The ridge above Redcloud looked almost gentle in the fading light, a soft gold brushing over the jagged horizon. But everything below it had gone still. No wind, no birds, just a low pressure behind the ribs, like the mountain was holding something back. Calder Boone crouched beneath a stand of spruce, eyes locked on the ridgeline, hands wrapped around a flare he hadn't lit yet. The red casing felt warm in his palm, almost alive. He'd carried it all the way from the cabin, all the way from the last outpost of anything resembling his old life. And now, there was nowhere else to go. The search team had moved fast, faster than anyone expected. They weren't reckless. They were determined. They'd narrowed the grid, moved in with 24 bodies. No drones, no trucks, just boots and paper and voices crackling over handheld radios. They had no idea what they were chasing, but they believed in it now. That made them more dangerous than anything that breathed in these woods. Redcloud Canyon was closing in. Calder could hear them less than half a mile out. Voices low, clipped, tactical. Dogs muzzled now, but eager. Flashlights bobbing between trees, every beam too bright for this hour. Somewhere behind him, in the hidden bend below the saddle ridge, the family waited. The mother barely moved anymore. Her limp had turned into something deeper, an ache that slowed her whole frame. She spent most hours curled around the 3 young ones, breathing heavy, eyes tracking every leaf, every sound. She hadn't stood upright in a day. Her breath whistled. Her weight had dropped. Still, she'd refused to let them go without her. And Calder hadn't asked her to. Stone had grown fierce. He stood at the mouth of the den, chest wide, always between her and the world. Glint had vanished up the hill earlier that day and returned with moss, mushrooms, and something like a dead hawk. He laid it by her feet and waited. Wisp hadn't left her side. He didn't eat. He didn't play. He just watched the sky. Calder had given them everything he had. The last of his smoked meat. Water boiled from creek runoff. Old pine shavings from his coat pocket to keep them warm. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. Not when the men came. Not when the first dog started howling. He didn't run. He moved uphill. Slow, deliberate. The ridge above the canyon opened into a saddle, bare and exposed, caught between 2 tree lines. He knew that crossing well. It was where the light always lingered last in the evening, where the wind never stopped. That's where he'd do it. Not to fight, just to buy time. He waited until the first headlamps crested the opposite slope. Then he lit the flare. It hissed like a scream through his fingers. A blood-red column of fire rose straight into the air, smoke curling with sparks. It wasn't meant to light the woods. It was meant to light him. He stepped forward, out of the shadows. One man, centered, still. The light swallowed him whole. They shouted. Dogs lunged. The flare roared. He threw it into the open and turned. Not to run, but to draw. Boots hammered the earth behind him. He took the ridgeline at a side angle, moving fast, but not reckless. Let them see him. Let them chase. That was the point. Below, through the trees, the den stayed untouched. They wouldn't risk splitting the team. He pushed himself hard. Down a slope he hadn't walked in years, past the split boulder that looked like a broken jaw, across a frozen creek bed that had turned to mud. His knees screamed. His lungs burned. But he didn't stop. He circled wide, doubled back, slid under deadfall and through brush so thick it scratched skin through denim. Somewhere behind, the dogs lost him. The men slowed. The red light faded, but the chase stayed alive. He reached the ledge above the den by instinct alone. The light was gone now. Only lightning crackled over the far peaks. A distant roll of thunder followed it, like something enormous shifting in its sleep. He dropped to his stomach, peered down, and saw them. Just silhouettes. The mother, slumped but awake. Stone pacing. Glint crouched beside his brother. And Wisp, kneeling near the brush line, hand pressed to the dirt like he could hear the roots breathing. Calder didn't climb down. He didn't speak. The storm had moved in fast. Thunder cracked again, this time closer. The sky opened in flashes, turning the trees into black skeletons. Then, the rain came. Not soft, Not steady. A wall of water slammed the ridges, flooded the canyon floor, turned paths into rivers. The search team scattered. He heard their radios spark, voices scrambled, dogs pulling against leash and fear. Trees bent under wind. A dead limb snapped and crashed down somewhere below. Then the lightning hit. A white bolt carved itself into the trunk of a pine not 30 feet from where they had gathered. The sound cracked the world open. The tree split down its center. One half fell toward the trail, right across the narrow path leading into the canyon. The fire that followed was short-lived. Rain smothered it, but the path was blocked. Nature had answered. Not for Calder. Not for them, but maybe for something older. He climbed down then, slow, soaked to the bone, breath heavy. When he reached the den, Wisp stood waiting, his eyes wide, his arms open. Calder didn't touch him, just crouched beside him, hand resting on his own knee. They sat like that for a while. No need to speak. The storm burned out just before dawn. The forest dripped. The dogs were gone. The searchlights had vanished. And the family, tired, wet, breathing, was still there. The mother looked at Calder once, long and deep. Her eyes dim, but not dull. She'd seen what he'd done. He'd bought them time, but not forever. He rose without a word, turned back toward the slope. His legs shook, and just before he disappeared behind the trees, something moved in the fog. Not behind him, not ahead, above. The male, massive, black against gray, standing at the edge of the mist, watching, not stepping forward, not stepping away, just watching. Then, as lightning cracked far behind the mountain range, Calder saw the family slip through the saddle, single file, disappearing into the canyon below. Not fleeing, just leaving. The flare was gone, the light had passed, but the echo of it lingered, burned into the retinas of everyone who had seen it. A man standing still in the red. A shadow larger than any story ever told. And the forest, once again, held its breath. By November, the canyon held its breath again. Not in fear, in memory. The kind of hush that settles after something sacred has passed through and left the ground slightly altered. The leaves had browned and fallen early, carpeting the trails in a soft whisper. Frost crept in each morning like a story retold in silence. The sun lingered low and slanted, catching in the smoke of chimneys, turning the cold into gold for a brief hour before it vanished again. Winter hadn't arrived, not fully, but it had made itself known. Calder Boone stayed. Not hidden, not hunted, just present. The search had ended weeks ago, quietly. No press release, no victory speech. Just a folded-up operation and a convoy that turned around before the snow claimed the roads. No one had found what they came looking for. No footage, no tags, no answers. The official story was, nothing verified, too little data, effort closed for season. Calder knew better. He had been questioned, of course. Detained, in the polite way people with power use when they don't want to say arrested. He hadn't run. When they reached him 2 days after the storm, boots and clipboards and red-eyed dogs on shortened leashes, he'd been sitting by the fire boiling creek water, carving into a fresh plank of pine. He didn't lie. He didn't confess. He just didn't offer. They checked his cabin. They asked about signs, footprints, trail cams. He said he hadn't seen anything unusual. They didn't push too hard, because someone higher up had told them not to. Dr. Marjorie Hale came in person. She didn't wear a uniform. She wore a slate gray coat and a wool scarf and glasses she kept wiping on the hem of her shirt. She asked if she could sit down, and when Calder nodded, she did. She didn't say much, just looked at him for a long time, then said quietly, "We can't afford another mess. Not after the last one. I need this to go away. And if you help me do that, I can make sure no one comes back here. Not with scanners, not with guns." He didn't respond right away, just watched the steam curl off the coffee mug between them. Finally, he asked, "What do you want me to be?" She tilted her head. "A local consultant, with strict terms. You'll draw up a corridor protection plan. Non-invasive, no trail markers, no GPS, no photography, no mapping, no names. You'll sign a paper that says you're helping monitor a rare ecological zone. That's it. Calder stared into the steam. And you'll stay out. She hesitated. I'll keep everyone else out. He nodded once. And that was the deal. Roy transferred out by the end of October. No goodbyes. Just a folded note left in Calder's coat pocket one morning, slipped in during a visit that neither of them ever mentioned out loud. Keep the fire low. If you hear 3 knocks, it's me. That was all. The days shortened. The air lost its bite and settled into something colder than cold. Stillness. Calder stacked his firewood tight along the north wall. He patched the roof with his own hands. The kind of work that made the body forget everything except what mattered. He started carving again. Not for record, just because. He etched outlines into leftover oak. Shapes of trees, birds, shadows in motion. Sometimes he added marks only he understood. A curved scar above a footprint. A cluster of 3 dots. A notch carved so shallow it disappeared in certain light. He didn't climb the ridge. Not for weeks. Not until the snow came soft and dry one early morning, dusting the porch, resting gently on the windowsill. He woke before the kettle boiled, threw on his coat, and stepped outside barefoot. Something in the air had changed. Not a warning, a memory. He followed it. Not rushed, not hoping, just walking. The trail wound through the thinning woods, familiar as breath. The stream had narrowed, glassy in the early cold, edges crusted with hoarfrost. The trees no longer whispered. They listened. He climbed slow, letting the weight in his knees remind him where he was. And when he reached the overlook, just past the break in the pines, he saw them, far below, small at that distance, but not mistakable, not imagined. Moving as a unit, not away, not toward. Just there, as they had always been. The mother walked again, slow but upright. Stone led the group now, taller than ever, broad-shouldered, his gait wide and confident. Glint moved like he'd grown into his name, quick, observant, circling wide but never too far. And Wisp ran, not awkwardly, not behind. He ran across the frozen creek, across the open basin, light on his feet, arms open to the wind like it was something he knew by name. He was strong now, not large, not loud, but alive. Alive in a way that made the throat close just to see it. Calder stood without moving. He didn't wave, didn't call, didn't step closer. The canyon didn't need that. The boy, if that word still applied, paused once near the edge of the water. Looked up, not straight at Calder, but close, long enough, then turned and vanished into the trees. No fanfare, no last look, just gone. Calder exhaled. Not sharply, just enough to fog the air in front of him. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just stood there. The snow began again, light, brushing his shoulders like ash. The wind didn't bite. It rapped. Gentle. He turned back toward the cabin, walking slower than he had in years. Not because he was tired, because there was no need to hurry anymore. The mountains weren't empty. They never had been. He boiled the water. Drank the tea. The fire crackled like it had a secret to keep. Outside, the trees didn't move. Not yet. But when night fell and the stars returned, Calder stepped out one last time before sleep. The sky was clear. The frost had glazed the porch rail smooth. He looked out over the ridge, not expecting anything, just feeling the weight of stillness. And then, faintly, barely a sound. 3 knocks. Not close. Not a threat. Just a reminder. He didn't turn. Didn't need to. Somewhere out there, something remembered. And as the kettle whistled and the flame danced low, the forest closed its eyes once more. Not in fear, not in finality, but in promise, because winter doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes back in silence, and that silence was exactly what Calder had promised to protect. Sometimes the greatest acts of compassion happen in silence. not in the roar of headlines or the flash of cameras, but in the quiet spaces between fear and understanding. When one heart chooses not to run, not to fight, but simply to stay. And sometimes, staying means everything. This story wasn't about heroes or monsters or proving something to the world. It was about the simple truth that every living being, no matter how different, how wild, how hidden, wants to be safe, to be seen, and if the world is kind enough, to be loved without question. What makes us human isn't just our language or logic. It's our willingness to care for something we may never fully understand. It's the courage to protect, even when no one's watching. And it's the grace to walk away without asking for anything in return. That kind of love doesn't need a name. It doesn't need permission. It only needs to be real. There are places in this world that hold their own secrets. Places where the trees remember, where the wind carries stories never written down. And maybe those stories aren't meant to be studied or solved, but felt, held, protected. Maybe that's the only way they survive. Maybe that's the only way we survive too. Because in the end, it's not about what we take with us. It's about what we leave behind. A path undisturbed, a kindness returned, a silence honored. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something you didn't expect, please take a moment to leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what stayed with you. And if you'd like to walk alongside more stories like this, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. There's more to come. And sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truths. Until next time, may you walk gently, and may the forest always remember your kindness.